Okay, Eamon, so we have an unusual situation where both Nicola and Niall are tied up with other crime world stuff, which means they're clearing the subs bench today and you're stuck with me. But we'll power on through.
No worries. It's nice to see you.
So you are covering the Richard Satchwell trial this week, and today's the fourth day of evidence. So Mr. Satchwell denies the murder of his wife Tina in Youghal, County Cork in 2017. Her body was found under the stairs of their home 6.5 years later, 2023. And then we heard this week how he claimed to Gardaí that Tina had attacked him with a chisel, and while he was defending himself, she went limp and died, and then he buried her body. So today, as I said, it's the fourth day of evidence, and we're hearing more interviews that he did with the media just in the kind of maybe year period after her initial disappearance.
Yeah, so yesterday's evidence, they went through a number of these different interviews he did, both on TV and local radio stations. So there's 14 in total, and they went through 8 of them today. And they were kind of in, I suppose, the first couple of ones were short enough ones. They were not too long afterwards. So this is in July 2017. So she would have been officially declared a missing person in May of that year. So this is kind of relatively soon after her disappearance. And one of those interviews that was played was a short enough kind of TV news. It was Paul Byrne from TV3 on the 14th of July, TV3 as it was called then. And he said, look, there was a couple of things he said, like, say one word, another, it'll all come out in the end and it'll prove I've done nothing wrong. And he says, and in terms of how, when he reported her disappearance to the Gardaí in Fermoy, he said, I went by what I thought my wife wanted me to do. And he says, I know my wife better than anybody. I probably know her better than myself.
Yeah.
And he complained, which he did in other media interviews that the jury heard yesterday, he complained about, some of the press based on TV interviews he'd done. And he described some of them as misleading and fabricated. And he said that he wasn't going to do any more interviews. And he also mentioned that, in the 28 years that he's known her, they were married for 25. For the 28 years that he had known her, he'd never lifted a finger against her. They're a good, quiet, loving marriage.
Yeah.
And he was asked in this particular interview if he would take a lie detector test. And he said he would. And he also complained that he says that the house was, in this interview, that the house was searched without his knowledge and nothing untoward was found. And, in reply to some commentary, possibly in reply to commentary on social media, he was saying, I don't know why people have been so malicious. I'm an innocent man.
Yeah.
So that was exhibit number 15, that brief interview.
Because so correct me if I'm wrong, but this interview happened in July 2017. Tina disappeared in March 2017. And then he had kind of told the Gardaí a little bit in the weeks after, but then she wasn't officially reported missing until May 2017. And then in June 2017, the Gardaí got a warrant for the house and searched it and took away some documents and laptops, but they didn't find any blood spatter or anything like that. So then the TV interview that you're referencing there was a month later in July. Is that right?
Yeah. So this is part, I suppose, of an appeal for information, for help in trying to find Tina Satchwell. Now, Crime Call did a short piece on it as part of their program on the 25th of July. It was, he wept, he was dabbing his eyes, and he kind of went through the narrative that we've already heard a couple of times through the various Garda statements and the opening statement of the case yesterday about how he went to Dungarvan at her request to go to Aldi. When he came home, she was gone, the dogs were there, her phone was there and her keys were there, and he hadn't seen her since. And he was asked, have you anything to say if Tina's watching this? It was, Tina, come home, no one's mad at you, people have to know you're all right.
Yeah.
So then the next interview he did was actually, sometime later, is the 30th of November in 2017. And it was with Paul Byrne from TV3.
Yeah.
And it was it was a kind of a recap again, another appeal. And he spoke about her, she was my daylight. And he says, from the day he first saw her, even before he first spoke to her, was like a dream come true for him. And he said his life has been one long honeymoon. They did part of the interview, they said, at the lighthouse in Youghal where he first proposed to her. Okay. And then he was asked about, what about Christmas this year? And he said, well, if Tina's not here, I'm not celebrating it. And he mentioned last year's Christmas was brilliant, but there won't be any Christmas for me.
Yeah.
And then, ask then, was there ever any violence towards her from him? He says, I've never once in 30 years lifted a finger. And never was his reply when he asked, did he kill her? Paul Byrne asked him straight out, did you kill her? And he just said never.
Okay, yeah.
So the next interview after that then was, again, this is the primetime interview on the 25th of January 2018. And this is a full documentary program, and it was played in its full length in court in front of the jury today. And they spoke to, there was lots of different people interviewed. There was relatives, there was journalists who'd been covering the story. There was they spoke to various people. But in terms of Richard Satchwell, he was asked again, he wanted Tina to come home. No one was mad at her. This is sort of the cutout clips at the start of the documentary. And he was saying, he feels like he's looking in at my old life, and it's totally heartbreaking. Yeah. And they were in the house with him, the camera crew. He said, this is Valentine, the budgie. And there was another one that had been, a taxidermist had preserved another budgie. He was on, a parrot, on the fireplace in the house. This is in 3 Grattan Street.
Yeah. So this is where Tina's body would be found years later in 2023.
Yeah. And he mentioned about, again, he goes through how they met. He was just 21. She was 18 when he first met her. He describes the place where he proposed to her in October 1989. He showed photographs of their early days together. And they talked about when their parrot Pearl died in January that year. They cried for weeks, and he said they even had an autopsy done. And he says the new parrot that they got, Valentine, had come up on the internet on Valentine's Day, so they thought it was nice to call the parrot Valentine. Okay, and. They kind of, there's this, it's describing the program, their lifestyle about going to car boot sales on a regular basis. A journalist, Anne Mooney, is interviewed about them and says, their main social outlet seems to be car boot sales. They seem to live in a bubble together. They're very much in love. Yeah. There was a cousin who spoke about Tina as well and said she loved her fashion, swimming, walking, everyday stuff. Yeah. And Richard, in his house, he points towards a jacket and dress which he'd bought, I think, at the car boot sale just before she disappeared. Okay. He says he hasn't moved it. That's where she hung it when she came in, and hasn't moved it since. Yeah. And was Richard with any of the family members in these videos, or were they done separately? They were all. It was just, the clip that was shown to the jury. It's just you're not really sure where people are, where they've been interviewed. I mean, he was in his house for some of them. He was actually he was out walking on outdoors with the RT journalist Barry Cummins, and they weren't all obviously done on the same day either. There's even a second interview with Richard. I think he's in Fermoy, and they're back there, and it's some days afterwards, or some time afterwards, I presume, from when he was given the interview in the house where he's pointing out the dress and the parrot. He talked about, the day again. He goes through the whole situation of, bringing her up a cup of tea and she asking him to go to Aldi to pick up a few things. Yeah. And the night before, he mentioned, they got an Apache takeaway. He said they were doing a great deal for a meal deal for 2, and they'd buy one and have it between them. And they'd buy 2. And they keep one for the next day. He said, to me, everything was good. Yeah. He also mentions the money that was mentioned in evidence yesterday, that when he went back upstairs to check the sunbed to see if she was in there, he spotted the box where he kept the money, and the money was gone. And he says, I know she took over 26,000. I know that for sure. And he said he was asked, you kept that in the house? And he says, yes, in a very specific hiding place. And he kind of explains, she obviously felt she needed a break to get her head straight. And then he goes into the story again, about going to Fermoy to see the doctor. And he went to her family members who lived there. And when she wasn't there, he had expected her to be there. And when she wasn't there, he that's when he kind of gets worried. And he's quoted, he's telling them, they said, we haven't seen her. And literally 5 minutes after being told that, I was in the Garda barracks in Fermoy. Yeah. And a cousin again is talking about, they also contacted relatives in the UK, and they were also worried as well. Yeah. And he kind of says, on reflection, he says this in an interview, he says, on reflection, she was troubled by something, but he said that wasn't really for public consumption. Okay. And he said she could be laughing and then crying. He said it was like a switch. Yeah. And he says there is a reason why she's upset, and it was external to the relationship. And, to get up and go wasn't easy for her. And she said, she was actually, he also says then that the people that they knew from the car boot sale had said on the Sunday, she had gone around telling people that she loved him and that she would never hurt me. And he said this is probably her way of saying that she wasn't going to go off with someone else. And he was asked then about how he felt, and he was talking he was very lonely because I built my life around her.
Yeah.
And then again, he was talking about some of the print media coverage. And he was saying, I think the way the papers do stuff, I find it myself very confusing. Yeah. And he cited the Paul Byrne interview that he did recently, where he denied anything to do with his wife's deaths. But he said he didn't say that. He says, because I don't believe she's dead.
Yeah.
And so he was upset about and he said it. He said it's called lazy journalism. Journalists who are writing stories on the back of other people's interviews. And he was asked then, do you really think she's alive, by Paul Byrne? He said, I honestly, truly believe that. I wanted to get in touch and let people know she's all right. And then he also said, I think there's some bodies out there, there's people out there who know where she is. It's just that she had to have help from someone. And
was this in the summer after she disappears?
Yeah. So we're still only up until this is March 2018. So this is after the primetime interview.
So it's only a year since she disappeared. Yeah.
Well, what happened actually was. Sorry, I skipped ahead accidentally there. Yeah. So what happened after the primetime? There was actually some calls into the guards, and there was a number of people. Again, this is mentioned in future interviews he gives. That we heard this in interviews that he also gives to TVAM and to Cry FM on Cork and to Neil Prendeville on Red FM. Okay. And in that, it transpires that there was a search carried out at Mitchell's Wood. It's a forest not too far from Youghal, and that there's a number of people had contacted the guards about somebody apparently acting suspicious in the forest. So there was a search carried out there, and he gave this particular interview with Paul Byrne. This is the 7th of March 2018 interview, and he did that at the actual site. So he's outside.
Is this the second interview that he did with?
This is the second interview.
Yeah.
And so the second interview he gives with Paul Byrne. He's interviewed at the actual outside the site, and he's asked, like, what if it does turn out to be her, and he says, I won't be able to cope. And he says, I feel sick. I felt sick driving down from Youghal. And he said, look, we've never been at this place before. When they had, because they used to go visit places. He said, this is the first time I've stopped off here. I just feel sick. And he said the basic thought that it's possibly my wife could be behind those barriers. Like, so he was given this, emotional interview to Paul Byrne at that stage.
Yeah. So he was talking about maybe fears or, how he would react if this was the case.
Yeah,
that she was found there.
And the next day, then he was back on TV again the next day with Ireland AM with Mark Cagney and Ciara Doherty. So that would have been part of the same company that Paul Byrne was interviewing for, the same media company. And he goes through the story again, knowing it for 28 years, that they spent morning to night talking. Every job that he's ever had as a driver, she'd go with him. And he joked a little bit about how they got in a little bit of trouble one time because one of the companies he worked for had a rule for no passengers, and he was laughing, like, in hindsight at that. And he said he said there's a lot of stuff he doesn't want to put out there because he knows that Tina wouldn't want it out there. But as a couple, everything was good, and it was the best Christmas. So he's talking about March 27, so he's talking about Christmas 2016, that would be.
Yeah, just before.
So everything was good. And he's in this interview, he said, it was the first time that they kind of took pictures at Christmas, and some friends had said to him that, you can see upset in her eyes. And he was talking about, he mentions that one of her biggest fears that she didn't want to end up on antidepressants, and that, that a best friend of hers had told him that she was depressed, and he thinks that she needed to get out. And then he mentions himself that I did it myself in 2002. But the difference was when he left Ireland and went to the UK, leaving her behind, like, he was speaking to her every night on the phone. He was working over there, sending money home. And he develops this part of that story in another interview later on, we'll find out.
Yeah.
And again, he mentions the car boot sale where people were going around telling people that she loved me. then he gets into the story about Dungarvan and going over to get stuff and coming back and she's not there.
Yeah, because I suppose he kind of had referenced that, hadn't he, when he went to the guards in March when she disappeared, and kind of said that he thought she might have went away for space and he didn't formally report her missing until May. And I suppose that was kind of explained from his point of view about how, he thought that maybe she just needed some time to herself and that this wasn't completely maybe something that really surprised him. But then obviously he grew more worried when he realised that her family hadn't heard from her. She was obviously from Fermoy, and when he went to visit family, he realised then that they hadn't heard from her either, and then he got very concerned.
Yeah, and this whole kind of, again, he mentions in this interview about he didn't go to the guards straight away because she had previously said to him, don't call the guards. Because I'll call them on you. But he was asked by this on the TV AM. He said, well, why would she say, or why did she say she'd ring the guards on you? And his reply was like, that's the way she was. 1 minute she could be crying and then laughing. And he said, look, I knew there was something weighing her down. He says the relationship with her family was grand. He said, he was asked, that's in, Mark Cagney said, well, in past tense, not now. And he says, well, some parts of the family have come to my rescue. Other parts, it's the same as it was. And he says, look, if we were visiting, it was us visiting them and not the other way around. This is some members of the family, not all.
Okay.
And then he mentioned that he didn't have the number of her best friend. And then he was asked, like, had he tried to contact her? And he reminded him, look, she'd left her mobile phone in the house when he came back from Dungarvan. The mobile was there.
Okay.
And again, he was asked, like, well, why didn't you report her, like, after 12 hours or 24 hours? And he said, I was given there's a space she had said that she would have wanted. And it was only when he went to the doctor and to see the relatives in Fermoy, he said, we realised she wasn't there. The entire floor fell away from under me. I was 100% positive in my head she'd gone to Fermoy, and he had no reason to believe she'd gone anywhere else. And they were saying, like, he was asked, like, about why would you have conversations about if I disappeared, don't contact the Gardaí. He said, like, from day one, when something really serious happened in her family, he said her personality had changed. Yeah. But he said, looking back, I should have done something differently. And asked why she hasn't made contact, he kind of says, I wish I could answer that. I can't come up with a reason why she wouldn't. And then he said, and why do you think she's still alive? And he goes, I'm not strong enough to cope thinking the other way, Yeah. And he says, when the phone rings late at night and, maybe the guards are contacting him, he says, I get that spark of hope. And he mentions as well that, like, he wasn't arrested at this, he hadn't been arrested at any stage, that he went and spoke to the guards of his own accord. He says, I was an emotional mess. I probably did more crying than talking, and asked, was he a suspect? He said, well, they haven't voiced that. And he says, do you feel you're a suspect? And he says, I did originally. He says that the house search and all that, I was confused. But he says now he doesn't feel at this point in time, like in this interview that he's giving in the 8th of March 2018, he says he doesn't feel like he's a suspect anymore. Yeah. And as he's cooperating with the guards and he's giving them everything you want. Yeah. And he's asked then, does he find it difficult, people asking questions about, like, why he took 4 days? But again, he goes into the story again, about going up to see the doctor, and he says when he was at that doctor's interview, he said the doctor said to him, I was right to give her that time before I went to the guards. Yeah, this is again in the interview he's talking about, and with TV AM. Yeah, and that. And Mark Cagney actually asked him, is it possible that, she's not aware of what's going on, that she is somewhere else? And he said it's a possibility, but mental illness is one of the things I can't talk about. Yeah, and she didn't obviously have her phone with her. That was told how, she'd left her phone behind. And he hadn't at this point, he told how there had been no contact. This was March 2018. Yeah, 8th of March 2018. Yeah. So he does 2 more interviews then on the 10th and the 12th of March, and they're both with radio stations in Cork. And the first one was Cry FM, right, with Jerry Murray, and he was welcomed to the studio and thank you for being here. And his reply was, I'd rather Tina was here. And he goes again through the story of how they met and it was love at first sight, and that he was asked a couple of he was asked about the relationship, yeah, and he was talking about but with the relationship with the wider family. He said, I have a big family, but we haven't spoken words in years. They were upset with my choice of going out with Tina. They're pretty much anti-Irish. And he talks about when they got married. And they did, how originally they... they got married on her 20th birthday on the 30th of November 1991 in Oldham. And that, when they would go to car boot sales, it started off, they were just going there shopping. And then he used to sell off the stuff then that she didn't want anymore. And he says, and people gravitated towards us. And then if we didn't turn up at the car boot sale, some days people would be disappointed if they weren't there. He said it was a day out. I'd stay at the car selling stuff. She'd be out buying stuff. And he said the relationship was fine. It was never more than just sometimes a short fuse going off. And again, he talks about he's taken time out of the relationship and going to England in 2002. But he says they talked every day and asked about it. He said we still remained faithful to one another. He said he eventually paid off his debts and he dealt with whatever issues that he had in Ireland and then came back here.
Yeah.
And he said there was there was stuff he didn't want to go into because that's the way she would have wanted, and her family asked him not to. But he said, the depression started 4 years ago, which is 2012, and that and as time went on, he sat down with her and he said, trying to get her to seek help, and she would say, no, everything is fine in that regard. Yeah. And he said, he says there's one, he said it used to be normal for them to stay up until 3 a.m. chit-chatting, but now sometimes they'd only stay up till 10 or 11 at night and then they go to bed. Okay. And he says he didn't really notice the warning signs that, he says you grow ignorant of the things happening about you is what he said,
Yeah.
And he said, he said that she was stronger than me and she has a much stronger personality, and that I'm doing these interviews and I'm a fish out of water, and she's a gorgeous looking woman. And he was asked, would she cope better if it was the other way around? And he said, I talk with the heart for her, it'd be like water off a duck's back. And he mentioned as well, I'd pity anyone who tried to harm her, whether they got the better of her or not. He said anyone who laid a finger on her wouldn't walk away without some physical damage. And he briefly mentioned that she had hit him at least, during the, some of these short fuse moments that he referred to, but he never retaliated. And then he was asked, if she thought she was still alive. And he said, look, it's 50-50 between hope or that she is still alive and definitely, yes, she's still alive. And that if she did turn up back at the house someday, he said, I'd throw my arms around her and collapse on the floor with relief.
Yeah.
And he said, it's been a trying time for me since day one. He lives in a void, and every morning he wakes up hoping it's all gone. And then, he's asked about kind of some of the commentary or, people asking difficult questions and he said, go talk to the people who know us. And he said people from the press trying to get me to criticize Tina and put her down. He says, I won't put her down in any shape or form. And he's asked then, would he have done anything differently looking back? And he says, well, if I could turn with hindsight, he says, she always wanted to live in Youghal. And he says, maybe we should have given it more thought before we moved. And asked, was she happy here? And he says, well, I don't know now. She used to go out and walk along the boardwalk with Ruby, the Chihuahua, and she'd sit down and have her flask of tea, and he'd sometimes sit beside her. And he mentioned this as well in the Primetime Investigates interview. And he didn't he mentions in this interview about she's confiding with her best friend who lives outside Fermoy, and he didn't realize how close they were. And he was asked about some of the social media comments, the day he gave the interview to Paul Byrne while the search was going in Mitchell's Wood. There was comment such as, you love the sound of your own voice. And, and he said, no, he says, not like the sound of my own voice. He said, I've turned hundreds of interviews down. He said, if I'm talking, I'm doing wrong. If I'm not, I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah. And I suppose about 3 months after the search. Yeah. Okay.
So, well, it's the same month. So the woods was searched around the 7th of March. Okay. And it was a couple of days search, I think, went on.
Okay.
And this interview he's given to Cry FM on the 10th. So this is 3 days later. So there's been kind of reaction on social media. This is what the interviewer Jerry Murray is asking about in this interview.
Okay.
So this is all been played. I think it's this was on audio, so
Yeah.
the jury were listening to this in court, as were all the journalists, including myself. So we're watching this.
Yeah.
He's actually sitting there, and for a lot of it, he just has the head down, and I think he was resting his forehead on his hand while he's listening to this, like him talking about his wife and and the relationship and so on.
Yeah.
And Jerry Murray asked him a couple of different questions. Like he said, "Oh, you changed your car," and he said, "Like, why have you changed your car?" And he said, "Well, I bought it cheap and I got enough years out of it." And he says the car had become well known as being mine and Tina's, and he said I was being followed, so I decided it was time to change that. And again, he was asked, like, you know, if Tina's listening to any of the passion interviews that, you know, that you've been giving, like, are you angry that she still hasn't made any contact? And he goes, "No, I'm not angry. I'm disappointed." And then I believe somebody had to have helped her leave the house, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And during this interview, his phone goes off. And the interviewer says, "Oh, you know, go ahead, answer that." And you can actually hear, he tells someone they'll be up in a few minutes. And then it goes back to the interview, and he's talking about, you know, he trusts the guards 100%, and they've checked all the CCTV on the public transport, and they came up with nothing. So he figures then that somebody had to have helped her.
Yeah.
So that was the point he was trying to make there in that interview.
And he said he thought he was being followed. Did he explain?
No, that was just the interview. There was nothing else. This is just what he said to Jerry Murray.
Okay.
So he's also asked about, like, his own family, and he said, "Well, you know," he said, "I spoke to my father for the first time in a long time, just before Christmas. So this is the first Christmas after she has disappeared." And then he's asked, like, you know, because in a previous interview he'd said, like, he'd take a lie detector test, and would he do that? And he said, well, he's on medication, and so when he finishes that, he would do it. And he just said, again, he was asked anyone who's seen her to come forward. And he said after, he mentions in this interview that after doing the TVAM interview, that was on the 8th, so he's being interviewed on the 10th. He said the producers there told him that, you know, a man had been in contact with him and wanted to meet him and had information. So he goes out to the car park to meet this guy, but he rings the guards beforehand. He's explaining this into the interview, and they tell him, whatever you do, make sure you get his details. So he got his name and his number, and this guy meets him, and he tells him he definitely recognized Tina Satchwell on a strand somewhere walking a puppy. He remembers her because she looked cold, and he said, you need to wrap up. You're gonna catch a death if you don't. Yeah. And she said, "Oh, I just bought a new puppy." And he said the info gave me hope. He said it was like winning the lottery, but you can't collect it. Yeah. And you know, he said as far as he's concerned, you know, the guards, you know, were doing their job, and the kind of the interview kind of more or less finished there. Yeah. So did he mention if that had been reported to them, or that wasn't? Well, the next interview with Neil Prendeville on Red FM, it refers to this incident where the gentleman kind of approached him. Yeah. And the guards had been in contact with this man within an hour. Okay. Now Neil Prendeville straight away, he said, you know, he refers to all the media coverage that he's getting, and he says, "Have you had any sleep?" And he goes, "No, not much." And again, he was critical of the newspapers, and he actually says they're mentally incapable of printing stuff the way it is said to them. So he was complaining about, in this interview, about it. He says that, you know, they write up stories for maximum impact, and asked did he feel under siege? He says, "I do." And he says, you've done a lot of TV and radio. And he says, well, he's done it with Paul Byrne because he's shown me a lot of respect, and he asked me to do Ireland AM. And you know, he said like when he did the initial Crime Call interview, which was the previous year, he said there was a lot of, he felt like, you know, there was criticism, people saying, "Oh, you love the sound of your voice, you had your 15 minutes of fame." So he's just stopped blank doing any media at that point. Okay. And he said then, you know, he talks about the Mitchelstown Wood search and about the, you know, a man calling to say he'd seen Tina. And he explains that, you know, he'd spoken to the guards and this guy being absolutely certain. And he said, again, he repeats this idea that, you know, he said, "I was like a child when he said it to me. It's like you won 100 million in the lottery and you can't collect it." And the Gardaí told him that they were in touch with her. And then Neil Prendeville says to him, like, according to his notes, the witness who came forward wasn't reliable and had come forward in relation to another missing person. So this was kind of put back to him. And he said, And he said, Neil Prendeville said to him, like, oh, I don't think she's alive, Richard. Like, why would she put her loved ones through this? Why would they, let this dig go ahead? And he says, well, as I keep saying, I don't want to go down that road. If I lose hope, I've got nothing left.
Okay.
And he was asked about were they under professional financial pressure. Again, he talks about... He was asked then about, you said in the previous interview that she did say you were hit by her once, and he said she's a great woman. I'm not going to say a bad word about her. She had a flash temper. She might hit you and then cry and apologize, and I never hit back. He says the worst thing I ever did was hold her tight. And Neil Prendeville quotes, "Yes, you love the bones off her," which was a quote that Richard Satchwell had said in his Cry FM interview previously.
He had said he'd welcome her back and hug the bones off her.
Yeah,
if she was found. Okay, so this brings us up to March. We're still in March 2018 then, are we, at this point?
Yeah, so this is the interview. So this is still going on. And again, he was asked, like, was it possible that she had gone off with someone else? And he says, the one thing I know she'd never have done. And he'd already mentioned in one of the other previous interviews that while he was in the UK for that year in 2002, that they remained faithful to each other. And he was asked, like, isn't it not a bit bizarre for her then to have gone around the car boot sale telling people that she loved them? And he said, well, I didn't find out this until 10 days later. And he said he thought it was her way of telling him that she wasn't gone off with someone else. And that's as far as we got in the case today.
Okay.
And so that interview is going to continue being played to the jury.
Okay.
And then we'll find out then what day next we're going to start hearing evidence again.
Okay. So there were 14 media clips played to the jury, and audio, and so the primetime one obviously, and TV3 where. Did you see full videos there? Yeah,
there was the full videos, and as well as that, even the Paul Byrne interviews and the Neil Prendeville interview was on. I think it was recorded. So it was, but it was also recorded. So we actually watched the video of that interview as well.
So you could see.
You could see the interview in the studio.
And when that's happening, like, did they play the full videos and audios? So
they're just it's literally they're just going through the videos. Okay. There's no questions being asked of the witness. There's the investigating officer is technically the witness for this.
Yeah,
and he was introduced yesterday and sworn in, and he's just there to officially to play the videos. Yeah. So these have all just been played and are playing still, I guess, until they finish them off.
Okay.
At the next court session.
Yeah. So they're played. There's no cross examination.
It's just they're just let go and without any kind of commentary or explanation.
Okay. And is what's happening in the courtroom when this is happening? It's very quiet, obviously. And is Richard Satchwell he's watching, or was there any reaction from him?
Yeah, he's just watching. Like he pretty much He just sits in, he's sitting in court. Like, he normally seems to keep his head down. And at one point when he was being emotional on TV, he had his hand to his forehead, but, he's not showing any particular emotion or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. And then, was there anything else? Was there reference to CCTV footage today, or was it just all media interviews? There was
not a direct reference to the CCTV, but in the interview, I think one of the in the Primetime Investigates episode, there was an interview with Gardaí along with many other people, and one of the guards actually talks about they went through the CCTV and couldn't find anything with Tina in it, and mentioned that there wasn't a lot of CCTV in Youghal at the time.
Okay. And we'd heard, obviously, the opening day, we'd heard kind of, they run through what's going to come up in the trial, and we'd heard about, how they had harvested different CCTV. I think there was CCTV of Richard Satchwell collecting his dole payments, was it when?
That was in the post office on the day he was heading to Dungarvan to get the groceries or whatever it was, and the parrot food from Aldi.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so I suppose in relation to the media interviews were brought up until March 2018. And then I suppose to put it into context, this was a year after Tina disappeared. All of these interviews were happening. And then we've previously, the evidence has heard how in 2023, Tina Satchwell's body was found under the stairwell of her home, under the stairs of her home in Grattan Street in Youghal, County Cork. And I guess this is going to run until June, this trial. So there will obviously, we'll hear, we don't know exactly how the witnesses are going to be called, but there will be more evidence given in relation to what happened in the years following this.
So there's a lot more witnesses to come, presumably. Like they did mention that there would be 100 witnesses in total. So I haven't counted how many have appeared so far, and they actually have numbers, but they don't seem to be going in chronological order. Well, they're going in order, all right, but they're not. You're not getting every single one. So
So I suppose we've got to the point of where, we obviously the first day it gives you kind of a rundown of what's to come. The prosecution's opening their case, and then we've gotten to, how Richard Satchwell went to the guards. Then she was reported formally missing in May, and then these interviews happened kind of in the year after her disappearance. That search that you referenced happens. We're up until March 2018, and then I suppose when they went in to carry out a second search on the home, which is when they dug the home up in 2023, Richard Satchwell, I think he was arrested then. So I suppose that's where we are at the moment. So like we've got the opening statement, which the state outlines its case, which you described, which it's that's all said in court in front of the jury, so they're hearing all this. So this is now the evidence to prove the state's case. So and we so far got as far as the interviews with the media, and we've presumably a few weeks before we get to October 2023. Yeah, and this is why I suppose when people hear that it's going to run for 6 weeks and there's going to be 100 witnesses, people you might think, oh, that's a lot, but I suppose this puts it into context, because this is, nearly 7 years of a disappearance and an investigation. So, we'll be on the way. It'll be up till June until we hear the full the course of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I suppose normal service will resume probably tomorrow, Eamon, with Nicola. But thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.